Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your Satellite 2022 Conference Chair, Jeffrey Hill.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Day 2 of the Satellite 2022 Conference. The Satellite team and I thank all of you for being here with us this morning for our opening general session, followed by the opening of our exhibit hall. We hope your journey here was pleasant, whether it was a relaxing drive on the Beltway or a transoceanic flight, or both, and we hope you enjoy this week-long freedom from Zoom conference calls as we all get used to fresh air once again. It's a great time to be here in Washington, D.C., and not just because this week is peak bloom season for cherry blossoms, but also because it gives us a chance to figure out how this new, ever-constantly changing world of ours works and what our industry can do to make that world a better place. We have a brilliant group of speakers for you this morning, but before we get things started, I'd like to thank our opening general session sponsor, Thales Alenia Space, for their strong and loyal support of this event. They prepared a video for us to kick things off this morning, and I'd like to share that with you now. All right, thank you so much to Thales Alenia Space, our opening general sponsor. Before we begin today's panel, I'd like to introduce a very special guest speaker for this morning's welcome address, a person who has spoken at this event several times as a member of Congress, but now returns to us as a former NASA administrator. Jim Bridenstine has been one of the U.S. commercial space industry's strongest advocates for many years. A former U.S. Navy pilot with a love of rockets and space technology, Jim's tenure as the 13th administrator of NASA saw the first crewed mission launch from U.S. soil since the retirement of the Space Shuttle and the development of the Artemis program. And since leaving NASA, he has joined the advisory boards of Viasat, Voyager Space Holdings, and Acorn Growth Companies. And he joins us here today to reflect on the evolution of the U.S. space program, a relationship between government and commercial space industry, as well as to share his thoughts on space as a frontier environment for global business, policy, and security. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our opening keynote speaker, Jim Bridenstine.
Thank you, Jeff, for that very nice introduction. It is great to be back in Washington, D.C., and of course to be here at Satellite 2022. I know so many of us have been just clamoring to get back together and to be able to have these conferences, and it has been great to see so many old friends and new friends and to be part of this conference again. You know, a lot of people ask me, what are you doing since you left NASA? I want to start by saying, number one, I loved NASA. For years, it has been the number one place to work in the federal government. That was started, I think, under Charlie Bolden before my time. It's still happening today. NASA is the premier institution when it comes to space exploration and discovery on the globe, and the people there are amazing. All that being said, I am now back in Oklahoma with my family, where I'm from. I represented Oklahoma in Congress before I went to NASA, and I work for a private equity firm. The firm is called Acorn Growth Companies, and we invest exclusively in aerospace, defense, and intelligence. And so it's been a great experience learning the financial side of the aerospace and defense industry, and of course being part of the same team that I was a part of before. Now I'm doing it in the private sector, just not in the public sector anymore. But certainly it's great to be back here. I will also tell you I'm also on the board of directors for Viasat. I'm on the board of advisors for Voyager Space, which of course is building next generation space stations to eventually replace the International Space Station. and I'm on the board of the Aerospace Corporation. The thing that I hear in every board meeting I'm in, and quite frankly, every meeting I'm in that deals with space, the thing I hear that affects everybody, and will continue to affect everybody basically, in perpetuity, it will never end, is the issue of space debris. And people want the former NASA administrator to come out and talk about all of the exciting new things that are happening, and there are many, many exciting new things. And of course, when I was leading NASA, I focused on that almost exclusively. But we're at a situation now where all of us in this room who are involved in space, and it doesn't matter if you're in remote sensing or communications or exploration, pick your sector of the space economy, all of us involved in space have a responsibility now more than ever to do what is right when we think about the space debris situation, especially in low Earth orbit, where the regulatory environment, frankly, is not where it needs to be to have space sustainably. So when we think about this, I want to be clear. I am not talking about any in particular company. I'm talking about all of us, because this affects everyone in this room. I'm talking about all of us. But I want us for a second to think about a constellation of 15,000 satellites that has been licensed to launch by the FCC with a 1.5% predicted dereliction, satellites that are derelict. What that means is 1.5% of the satellites are not going to be able to deorbit, and they're not going to be able to maneuver. In other words, they become, in essence, space debris. So if you launch a constellation of 15,000 satellites, and 1.5% of them are going to be derelict, they can't maneuver and they can't deorbit, what that says is 225 satellites are known to be space debris. Again, I'm not mentioning any company because that is not what is relevant here. This is relevant to everybody in this room who has activities in low Earth orbit, or people in this room that have startups who want to have activities in low Earth orbit. So when we think about 225 derelict satellites, the probability, if you do an aggregate collision risk determination, the FCC said that there's a 1 in 44 chance of a collision with those 225 satellites. 1 in 44 might seem low, but when you think about the consequence of a collision in space, that is a very high probability. But friends, that's not where it ends. That's where it starts. A 1 in 44 collision risk only applies to the 225 derelict satellites. If there are 14,775 other satellites that do have the ability to maneuver, guess what? There is still a collision risk associated with those satellites. But that collision risk is not assessed. Nobody knows what that collision risk is. And that's a really big deal. When we think about historically how satellites were licensed, it was a 1 in 10,000 probability of collision or less per satellite. And so if you're going to launch 10,000 satellites with each one having a 1 in 10,000 chance of collision or 1 in 10,000 chance of failure, well, you're guaranteeing failures, you're guaranteeing collisions. But now what we're saying is the aggregate, which I think is important. It's a great move. The FCC did the right thing here. They said the aggregate collision risk, not the one by one, but the aggregate for all 225 satellites is 1 in 44. So that's important. But the other 14,775 satellites, there is a probability of collision with those satellites that is not considered at all. It's also important to remember that when we think about the risk of collision, it's not just the risk from trackable objects. For every object that is trackable, there's anywhere from 10 to 100 objects that are equally as lethal but not trackable, which is a challenge that all of us have to rise to. We have to think about what is it going to take to preserve space, not just for this generation, but for generations to come. So we think about these risks that we don't understand, and then we say, wait a second, I'm talking about a single satellite constellation. What if you add a second satellite constellation, a third satellite constellation, a fourth satellite constellation? All American companies, I know the audience here is generally American, but not entirely. Then we think about the European Space Agency, the European Union. They want to have large constellations in low Earth orbit for low latency, high throughput communications. We think about what China wants to do in low Earth orbit. We think about what Russia has had on the table, although I know they've got other issues right now. We think about all of these constellations that are on the table that are adding to the aggregate collision risk that we're going to be dealing with. And I hear some people say, well, we need to have these distributed low Earth orbit architectures for resilience. And that's true. We absolutely do. And by the way, it's not just low Earth orbit. We need medium Earth orbit. We need geostationary. We need all of the above for resilience. And I fully am on board with all of that. But here's the thing. Even if the satellites are all maneuverable and they're all autonomous and they're all doing astonishingly safe activities, the more and more and more low Earth orbit gets cluttered, a single collision can set off a chain reaction. Basically, even though they're all maneuverable, even though maybe they're all autonomous, we're adding fuel that when a collision happens, that idea of resilience goes away entirely. It's not only not resilient, you could lose low Earth orbit altogether. I want to be clear, we're not there now. But all of us in this room that are involved in the space business need to be thinking about these things. And when we think about, we hear all about ESG. I was in the ESG panel just yesterday, which, by the way, was very good for those who were on it. If you're in the room, enjoyed it very much. And almost half of the conversation was focused on preserving space. I think it's important for every company in this room, when you think about ESG, space preservation needs to be part of your ESG program, period. It absolutely must be, because space is so important to all of us. So I mentioned I'm on the board of advisors for Voyager Space. We're building habitation in low Earth orbit. I can tell you, as the former NASA administrator, we looked at the activities surrounding the International Space Station. When I was the NASA administrator, we had an ASAT tests from India. That debris affected the International Space Station. That debris forced us, in certain cases, to shelter. And by the way, currently on the International Space Station, our astronauts are having to shelter more frequently than ever before, and it's happening at an ever-increasing rate because of the amount of debris in space. It's going to continue growing. So when we think about the future of having maybe a dozen space stations, not the International Space Station, but a dozen space stations commercially owned and operated in low Earth orbit, which, by the way, is the direction NASA is heading and something I think we all want to see. We want to see the democratization, the commercialization of space. All that is very important. But friends, if we're not doing what's right in low Earth orbit, we're not going to have that hope for the future. So we have to be thinking about these things, and I think it's important to also recognize, when I was in the House of Representatives, I had a bill that had space situational awareness and space traffic management. It was going to be done at the FAA, Office of Commercial Space Transportation. Well, what was interesting is I was on the Science Committee, and the bill that I just introduced actually made, it gave the jurisdiction to the Transportation Committee. Oh my goodness, the members of my committee, on the Science Committee, they were upset with me because now I authored a bill that would give the jurisdiction to the Transportation Committee, and so basically they're going to be able to fundraise on all of these activities that are going to be done in low Earth orbit for space situational awareness, space traffic management. That is a broken system, by the way. You should only do what's right, period, and not worry about what committee has jurisdiction. It wasn't even parochial. It wasn't even about somebody's home district. It was purely about who's on which committee and who has authority. It was wrong. But here's the thing. We eventually said, okay, we'll redo the bill and we'll have it at the Commerce Department. And guess what we did? We had a bill that was focused on having the Commerce Department do space situational awareness and space traffic management. And we got bipartisan consensus on that. We got everybody on board. And by the way, when I went to the administration, we got Space Policy Directive 3 put in place, which also had it at the Commerce Department. So we had, at the time, we had the administration, we had the House, we had the Senate. Everything was in alignment, and we were able to pass a bill that would have the Commerce Department focus on space situational awareness, space traffic management. Here's the thing. It's not yet funded, at the level that it needs to be funded. And guess what? The Space Force is not the FAA for all of the commercial operators and all of the international operators. They shouldn't be in that role. Of course, they do it right now with the CSPOC because they do it by default, the Combined Space Operations Center. So all that's very important, but that is not their job. And we need to make sure that we do what is right as a nation so that we actually give it to an agency whose role it is to make sure that space is safe for the rest of us. It needs to be funded. That's my point here. Congress needs to step up to the plate and fund it at the levels that are being requested, not just by the administration, but that are necessary for the safe operation of all activities in low Earth orbit. There's another thing that is important to recognize. While it's not being funded, I think it's important to also recognize there are agencies that have authority right now that can actually make things happen. That, when you go through the payload review process to figure out what's going to get launched into space, it goes through an interagency process, and certain agencies that see a risk, they can do something about it. They can stand up and say, look, we need to pause because we're not comfortable with the direction that this particular constellation is going. I think that's an important capability, that whole interagency review process when you go through the payload review. I also think it's important to recognize that even right now, the FCC has authorities that it can use. And when we think about the impact of what happens should there be a collision in space, we need to start. It doesn't matter that we've given it to commerce and that commerce hasn't yet been funded. We have immediate action items that need to be done right now. And that's my big concern. So I want to say this. And as a former NASA administrator, I was here yesterday, and all the questions that I got were about the International Space Station in Russia. I want to be clear on this before I leave the stage. We have made, as a nation, the United States of America, huge investments into the International Space Station. It is now fully operational. It is fully manned. It is, and by the way, womaned. We did the first all-woman spacewalk when I was at NASA. The space station is operational, and we are getting returns on investment for the space station right now that are amazing and important for our country. Whether we're talking about pharmaceuticals, immunizations, advanced materials. Some of you in the room have heard me talk a lot about the 3D printing of human organs or human tissue at this point, but eventually human organs, the artificial retina for the human eyeball, all of these things that are going to be fundamentally transformational for how we live life on Earth. The International Space Station is being used to advance those capabilities so that there will be a future for commercial human spaceflight where those activities can be done and capitalized in the private sector. That's all important work. It is happening now, and the American taxpayer has made over $100 billion investment into this project. It is important for us as a nation, in my opinion, to make sure that the International Space Station continues through 2030. And by the way, that has been agreed to in a bipartisan way in Congress through 2030. Now, we all understand that we have a challenge right now that was unpredicted when the International Space Station came into being. We all understand that, and a lot of people get very temperamental about it. We need to make sure we're doing what is necessary as a nation to preserve this very important asset because it's important for our future activity for commercial human spaceflight. We are not going to recreate another International Space Station. We need to have all of the demand side be developed in a way where on these commercial human spaceflight capabilities of the future, there is a demand that warrants the capital investment today. The International Space Station is the way to get there, and we have to preserve this as an institution. So I want to, since I wasn't planning to come here and talk about that as an issue, but I think it's important since I've been here, that's what I've been asked about. I think it's important to put that on the table. But again, whether it's the International Space Station or these different human habitation capabilities that are being developed right now by the private sector, we have to make sure 100% that we are doing right to preserve the low Earth orbit environment. And so the call to action is this. Number one, if you have a space company, or if you're a part of a space company, You need to absolutely make sure that in the ESG program, space preservation is a huge part of that program, and you need to put in place steps to make sure your company is doing the right thing there. And number two, you need to think about how to engage with your member of Congress, whether it's a House member, a senator. We, as the space industry, need to step up to the plate and say, it's time to ask the important questions to preserve low Earth orbit. So I just want to say, first of all, the future is bright. It's very bright. I know that, I can't believe he's saying it's bright after all of this. The future is bright because I know that we're going to do the right things. When I say the right thing, we have to think about this. For just a second, consider this. There is a limit to how much you can put into any orbital regime. There is a limit there. Now, that limit changes as technology improves and autonomy improves and satellites get smaller and the debris threat goes down with the smaller cross-section of the satellites. There is a limit that exists today. That limit will expand in the future. All of it is important to recognize. It's also important to recognize that as of right now, what we have to do is we have to consider what that limit is, and then we need to understand that our friends and maybe our not-so-friendly countries around the world, they also will claim access to those same very important orbital regimes. All around the world, people are saying, we have access to that same orbital regime. There is no international regulatory body that is controlling any of this. So it's right now, it's on a first-come, first-served basis, and what happens is, you game it out, it ends up being, a downward spiral. It's the tragedy of the commons. It's the prisoner's dilemma. However you want to look at it from a game theory perspective, the outcome is unfortunate. But we need to recognize there's a limit. We need to allocate access to those very important orbital regimes based on nation. And then after the nations have those orbital regimes allocated to them, then they need to allocate it to their private companies in those countries. Right now, none of that is happening. We think about what happens at the ITU and geostationary orbit. It's happening, and it's working, and it has worked. We have seen at the ITU countries that are at war with each other go and negotiate orbital slots and spectrum at the ITU. That has happened. Friends, we need something similar in low Earth orbit. I don't know what that regime looks like, but here's what I know. There's a limitation. We need to define that limitation. We need to allocate access, and then after that access is allocated by country, it needs to be allocated to the private sector, and we also need to make sure that there is competition there. When I was at NASA, I talked about this frequently. The only thing worse than a government monopoly is a private monopoly that the government is beholden to. And I worry that as time goes on, we're going to get closer and closer to that. We need to make sure that there's competition, that the regulatory regimes that are established ensure that that competition is there and that it continues, because ultimately that's how the consumer benefits, that's how the market works, and of course the goal here is to use space to benefit all of our lives. So the way we communicate, the way we navigate, the way we produce food, the way we produce energy, the way we do disaster relief, national security, the way we do understand climate, the way we predict weather, all of these things that space has fundamentally transformed and quite frankly, established a dependency on space that most Americans don't ever even think about. And when I say dependency, you guys all know the story with banking and the power grid and terrestrial wireless networks and the internet. We are dependent on space in ways that most people don't consider on a day-to-day basis. If we lose space, it becomes existential to our very way of life. And guess what? The enemies of the United States know that, which is why they're launching anti-satellite missiles at the same time, creating constellations like GLONASS or Beidou in order to basically have their own. The GPS signal is free. It's available to everybody all around the world for free. And countries are saying, look, you know what? We're going to build anti-satellite weapons, and then we're going to build our own GPS constellation. It's not by accident. The point is this. People around the world know that we are dependent on space, and therefore they're creating capability to make it an existential threat to our way of life. What we have to recognize is that we are in fact dependent on space, and because of that we need to preserve it. And a lot of times we're not preserving it, and the US government is not properly equipped to regulate all of these activities. But we can. Space is transformational. It's going to change all of our lives even more than it already has. And of course, the amount of opportunity there from a capital investment perspective, all of that is there today. It will be there in the future. But we need to make sure we're doing the right things to make sure that stays that way. I just want to say it's great to be back here at Satellite 2022. It's been great being together with all of you again. Of course, I'm going to be here today and tomorrow, so I've got meetings set up. But I'd love to say hi to you as we go about our days if you guys see me in the hall. So again, thank you to Satellite 2022 for having me. Thank you all for being here. And again, two things. Remember, number one, ESG includes doing the right thing as it relates to space debris. And number two, make sure you're talking to your members of Congress and senators so that they understand that there's a real issue here that is not being dealt with right now adequately, either by the U.S. government or in international fora. So with that, I want to say thanks, and we'll see you around the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jim, for being with us this morning. I now turn things over to Via Satellite Editorial Director Mark Holmes, a good colleague of mine who I have not seen for 3 years. This is his first panel since the pandemic, so I'm very excited to see him back here up on stage. He's leading a discussion titled A Defining Era for the Satellite Industry with a diverse group of thought leaders from some of the most innovative companies in our community. So I will now turn things over to him. Please enjoy our opening general session.
This moment is what we have been waiting for. It's more than our return to Washington, D.C. It's more than each of you being in this room. This moment is about perseverance. This moment is the first step forward in what will be a momentous year for our community. This moment is about creating opportunity and expanding our horizons. This is Satellite 2022. The world as a whole has weathered the past 2 tumultuous years, and we're emerging stronger than ever, ready to set a narrative that takes us further than we've been before. Nothing can replace the social and economic value of face-to-face, and that is what we are delivering at Satellite. This is your time to connect with your colleagues and set your path for the year to come. This week will be filled with inspiration, conversation, and discovery. And it starts now with our opening general session. Sponsored by Thales Alenia Space. Thank you for being here, and welcome back to Satellite 2022.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Via Satellite's Editorial Director, Mark Holmes.
Hello, everybody. How are you all doing? Good. I think the last time I was here, I was mistakenly introduced as the Vice President of the United States, so I'm pleased got my own name. Before I begin some questions, I just want to say on behalf of the team of Via Satellite, obviously for everyone, been a tough 2 or 3 years, but we're super delighted, all the support that you've given us, and we really appreciate it, so thank you very much. So let me introduce, we have a great lineup of speakers today. We have Neil Masterson, the CEO of OneWeb. We have Dan Goldberg, CEO of Telesat. Mark Dankberg, the CEO of Viasat. Tina Gator, the CCO of Mynaric. Sarah Schellpfeffer, the CTO of Northrop Grumman. And John Finney, the CEO of Isotropic Systems. So we have a great lineup. We don't have huge amounts of time, so we're going to get straight into it. Before I do a general question for the panel, I'm going to ask Neil a question first, because OneWeb has been all over the news. So Neil, tell us what happened and your sort of observation of what happened with Roscosmos and then the deal with SpaceX and how that all came about.
Thank you, Mark. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation today. Look, first of all, can I just start off by saying, OneWeb, and I think from a personal perspective, our thoughts are much more with the folks in Ukraine who are dealing with an absolutely unbelievable situation, and that is far above the issues that we've been facing. So we have to put these things in perspective. I think second, you've asked me some specific questions there, all of which I'm going to seek to avoid answering, frankly. However, what I would say is that we were caught up essentially in a geopolitical situation. We were forced to make a choice, so we did. Yeah. We made sure we got our people out. We have some work to do on the equipment, but fundamentally. If anybody didn't think, 30 days ago that, the satellite industry was not strategically important, they do now, right? And I think from our perspective, we remain absolutely determined to continue the deployment of our constellation. We're 2/3 done. We want to finish the job, and so that's what we've been working very hard on in doing over the last few days, and we'll continue to be doing so. And obviously, you saw our announcement yesterday. And, we're delighted, SpaceX have certainly stepped up, and we appreciate that.
Fantastic. Well, let's go to the rest of the panel. I mean, there's a saying that the revolution will be televised or nowadays maybe broadcast over social media. It's been 3 years since I've been on this stage. We've had some satellite events during that time. Are we at the start now of a revolution within our industry, and how do you, where are we as an industry, and is this the start of a completely new chapter? Tina, let's go to you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me. I certainly hope we're in a revolution. I've been in the industry a while, and I think there's some exciting things happening with the new constellations coming about. I think we've got some great new technologies being fielded. We're excited to be part of that, from an optical communication standpoint. I think affordability, access to space was coming through, and it's become a real thing now. And just the new entrants from satellite builders, some of the new players are coming online, and that would have been unheard of, 10 years ago. So now you've got small sat players that are really making constellations come together, networks come together. So I'm all for the revolution coming in.
Fantastic. John?
Yeah, I think it's already happening, but it's at multiple levels. I mean, Elon Musk has 73 million followers, right? So by definition, he's already advocating making people aware about the use of the system. Amazon, of course, have the massive distribution model. So at that initial sort of social layer, we're seeing awareness of space systems rising through factors such as that. I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of hope for information being delivered worldwide, effectively bridging the information digital divide. And if you think about the information wars that are happening right now as it relates to what is offered to Russia versus what we see as the rest of the world, of course, we absolutely fundamentally believe that those systems do have an intrinsic benefit in the sense that it's very hard to stop access to those systems if they are ultimately profitable and sustainable, and there lies in the problem. Because unfortunately, and it sort of talks to the earlier points that were made, there is a substantial gap between the size, scale, and distribution of those LEO systems to the actual to where the population is that needs to enjoy them, and the business case doesn't particularly hold together too well. So my fear is that ultimately these systems are put up based on financial power, but with a limited financial business model. It raises expectations that those capabilities will be there, and they ultimately don't see the second and third generations, and they're not delivered. So there's a lot of work to do to actually see information become a right across the world. Many people have tried and failed, and the jury's out on this one, in my view.
Thank you. Very interesting comments. I feel I need to go to Neil and Dan to follow this one now. So, Dan, obviously I think you're the longest serving member on the opening general session. What are your thoughts on where we are, and I guess sort of some of John's comments there about the constellations?
Well, I mean, what would I say? I've been in this industry for a while now, and a hugely exciting time to be in the industry, just in terms of the amount of investment that's taking place, the amount of new players that are coming into the market, the amount of technology development that's driving all sorts of new opportunities. And what would I say? I don't know. I mean, for me, I sort of do that big step back and ask, you know, why is all of this going on right now? I mean, you know, as always, it's being driven by what our customers want and what's happening, you know, kind of more broadly in the world out there. The reality is, and COVID, I think, you know, accelerated a whole lot of these trends, but everybody needs bandwidth. They need it everywhere. It's got to be reliable. It's got to be secure. It has to be affordable. And there are huge pressures to make sure that, I don't know, it's sort of democratized, which is to say that everybody has it. And countries are putting, you know, huge amounts of money to work to make sure that that happens. But for me, I don't know, it's kind of a continuum of what we've seen in our industry for the past 50 years or whatever. I mean, you know, way back in the 60s, it was all about connecting the world just so people could talk to each other on the telephone. And that was, you know, Intelsat, that was Inmarsat, and that drove huge investment, huge technological development. And there's always this kind of, you know, give and take between what consumers want and what the world wants and what technology allows. And for sure, they reinforce each other. The more folks want something, the more money goes there, the more these technologies are invented. As these technologies become available, the cost comes down. So it's sort of a cycle like that. But we saw it with people just wanting to talk to each other on the telephone. We saw it with video distribution, right? We're all analog. Everyone wanted to watch more television. Cable TV came, you know, CNN, just all of that. And then everything went digital, and then there's multi-channel television, and that drove all sorts of investment in technological development. And then the internet came. And I credit Mark and his colleagues at Viasat with doing a lot of really good innovation to drive down the cost of bandwidth with high throughput satellites and the like. And here we are with, you know, NGSO now. So I don't know. I mean, it's a long answer. But for me, super exciting time. The business cases have to make sense. As always in our industry, there will be winners and losers. It's not just our industry. That tends to happen in most industries. So anyway, I'll stop there, but just to say, because we've got a little time, but hugely exciting time. I think about where we are in kind of at this moment in time, in that, you know, context of that larger continuum, and yeah. So I'll hand back to you.
Let me go to Sarah next, and welcome to the panel, Sarah. What are your thoughts from a Northrop Grumman perspective, where we are as an industry right now?
Yeah, so Northrop Grumman, we've been leading in this industry since the first space revolution. And I think we see, you know, in addition to the remarks just made, you know, what's possible with space exploration with James Webb Space Telescope having just gone up. What an exciting moment on December 25th to wake up and watch that launch. And, you know, Northrop Grumman led the industry team for NASA. And it is going to transform how we understand the universe and potentially other things. And, you know, what's possible from a research, from our understanding of astrophysics, for what could be provided to everybody by that system. I think that is an aspect of the revolution we're very excited about.
Excellent. Let me go to Mark, and an industry veteran of many years who's seen the industry, I hope you don't mind me calling you that, seen the industry change and evolve quite a lot in recent times. Obviously, Viasat was involved in probably, well, maybe the biggest news story last year with the acquisition of Inmarsat. How do you sort of assess the sort of current sort of state of play? I mean, I think your perspective is somewhat unique. So,
so I've been, I used to be the youngest guy on these panels. So now, I've been around for a long time. What's interesting is the very first satellite project I worked on was a low Earth orbit satellite project. It was for the Air Force in the 1970s, late 70s. The very first thing that, one of the first ground system programs we worked on at Viasat in the early 90s was Iridium. So I kind of I agree with Dan. It's what we're really seeing technologically is really evolutionary. What I think is really, really changing now is it's not so much that the world's leading power in space is getting better. It's that the whole rest of the world understands the significance of space, right? And that's a big deal. And you can look at what's going on in Ukraine, which is awful. And let's not forget that Ukraine has a very strong history in technology and space. But on the other hand, most people wouldn't think of Ukraine as one of the most modern militaries, but you just look at the news and you can see the impact that access to space is having on the war in Ukraine. Right? It's like, hey, I've got Earth observation, I've got precision targeting, I've got reliable communications. And the rest of the world, I'm sure, is looking at this because we've worked globally for geosynchronous satellites for decades, and we've always seen an interest in other countries saying, hey, we want our own, whether it's for a broadcast system or a data system. They're looking for how do they get assured access to space. And now it's possible, not only from a satellite perspective or Earth observation or GPS, but from a launch perspective. There's so many launch programs the rest of the world. So I think one of the most important things, and it's actually one of the things that Viasat has kind of pivoted to. When you start a company, you start thinking of, okay, world leadership, world domination, and what we realized is probably our best business model is helping and augmenting countries around the world who want their own space programs. I think that is a big change for the world, and I think for those of us that are US-centric.
Okay, I want to talk about the ground side a little bit because we often talk about constellations and numbers, but we talk about this revolution in space. But we also look at the ground tech, and talking about a revolution there, smaller, better, cheaper terminals, equipment. Are we seeing this actually happening? Because we've been talking about this for a long time as well. So let me go to John, Tina, and Sarah for this one.
So, cheap means worthless. Right? And, there is a potential here for reasons that I don't think anybody needs to go into, that the space sector in terms of the total available capacity may move into a commodity space, right? And so the name of the game for everyone is to avoid that and to avoid a situation which is analogous to fiber optics in the early 90s, right, where essentially there was an overbuild before that demand could be met. The difference here is we're talking about a non-recoverable, degradable assets in space. So ultimately, in our view, differentiation is absolutely key because differentiation is what creates value, and value is worth something. So, I think for our sector, for the ground sector, frenemies as we are, and there's some great practitioners of ground antennas in the audience. We all are trying and striving to do different things that fundamentally drive value, close business cases. But if I'm completely honest, we don't like the word cheap. We like the words value, opportunity, differentiation, closing the business case. Because if that does not happen, we will end up as a commodity by virtue of oversupply. We won't access new markets, highly profitable, high margin, high growth segments. So from our point of view, and I think it's shared with our peers in the ground sector, that's the only language that we're interested in. The only narrative for cheap terminals, honestly, is around consumer broadband. And if I'm brutally honest about that, nobody in our sector is interested in it. What are we going to make, $20 a terminal? It really is of no interest to the mass majority of the leading players in the ground sector, because we want to create value, not commodity.
Okay, let me go to Tina.
Let's try a different word. How about affordable? Right, so I think making ground terminals affordable is important, and you can do that whether you're a service provider and drive your cost per bit down if you're subsidizing your end user terminals, whether it's consumer or enterprise. I think that's an important factor because you're serving the world. There are different markets that affordability is a different status depending on where you are in the world. So if you're in it to connect the world in different markets, affordable ground terminals are key to getting that proliferation and use of what we're trying to build here as a community, whether it's lower Earth orbit constellations, a very large stationary bird, hugely powerful. But at the end of the day, what are we serving? We're serving an end consumer, whether it's a business or an end user. So affordability is key, and you can drive the cost down at different stages of your network. We're looking to drive it down, on a cost per bit by introducing optical communications in the network. We're not inventing anything new. We're leveraging technology that the terrestrial folks have been out there investing billions of dollars in. We're qualifying it for space. We're qualifying it for the ground. So you can move large chunks of data via this medium. So that would drive the cost down at the end user terminal.
Sarah?
I think also the interoperability of those terminals and with multiple systems, commercial, civil. Additionally, how the ground systems that operate the satellite systems have evolved and will need to evolve and continue to evolve as automation is required for more integrated operations. And then as cloud technology becomes more integrated with those ground systems and the space systems, I think that will continue to drive innovation as well.
Okay. A question more now for Neil and Dan. We're talking about this era of thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of satellites. Where is all the business going to come from, and how will the likes of OneWeb and Telesat generate business away from obvious sources such as like the UK government or UK Indian governments and the Canadian government for Telesat? So where, outside of those customers that, to be honest, you expect to have partnerships with, where is all the business going to come from?
Maybe I'll start from Telesat's perspective. I don't know, a couple observations. First off, we're a satellite operator today. And so, got about half our business, for video distribution, and the other half of our business comes from non-video. So enterprise services, providing backhaul connectivity to mobile network operators and ISPs all over the world, providing bandwidth connectivity for the aeronautical industry, the maritime industry, and the government industry. And those are the very verticals that we, at least at Telesat, I think Neil kind of thinks about it the same, are focused on with our Lightspeed constellation. And so those are big markets. And, on the one hand, they've been around for a long time, but they're growing. And they're growing fast, and we think that the addressable market within those verticals is significantly bigger than what we're able to achieve with our geostationary satellites if we bring to the market a value proposition with bandwidth connectivity that, is cheaper, higher performing. And for us, a lot of that has to do with low latency connectivity, but also having a network that is more distributed, more ubiquitous in terms of its coverage. And so, we've been providing these services and serving these markets for almost 50 years now. We know these customers, we know the technology, we know the regulatory environment in all these different markets, and it's growing quickly. And so anyway, that's how we built our business case. It's not thousands of satellites, it's hundreds of satellites that are very advanced, very capable, focused on those verticals. We designed this constellation, not just kind of talking to ourselves in a conference room in Ottawa, but engaging with our customers in all those different verticals. So anyway, I think that's how we're going to be successful. That's why we're bullish about our plans. Yeah, that's how we think about it.
Before I go to Neil, what do you see as sort of the balance going forward between government and commercial or non-government business as it sort of relates to sort of Lightspeed?
I think, for us, the way we've designed our Lightspeed constellation, I think it has very attractive applications for government users. For all sorts of reasons, and for many of the reasons that you hear from, government space planners about why a pivot to LEO makes sense in terms of having more distributed architectures, the benefits of low latency, the inter-satellite links, I think, are important for allowing all of our users, but government users too, to leverage all the advantages from a distributed NGSO network. But when we think about our business case, what does the revenue mix look like 10 years from now? It's still heavily non-government.
Okay. Neil, let me get your from a OneWeb perspective.
So there's first of all, hundreds of satellites, not thousands. Let's be clear on that. The second point would be 70%, broadly speaking, fixed and enterprise, 20% government, remainder mobility. That may have changed over the last 30 days, but that's kind of generally speaking. And I would tell you the demand signal we see, we don't have a demand problem, we have a fulfillment problem. Mm-hmm. Right? That's what I would say. To answer your last question, price of terminals really matters. And yes, based upon the panel of user terminal manufacturers that we see, yes, we see prices going down. And that's important, of course, because actually the service is experienced at the user terminal level. It's not experienced by the satellite in the space or the rocket, it's experienced at the user terminal level. And demand, what we see is demand is very much use case driven. And for those use cases require different sorts of terminals. And I completely agree the notion of having LEO GEO terminals. I think it's exactly the right way going forward. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no. Just one follow-up to you, Neil. In terms of, if you can name like one vertical that you think is maybe outside of government, that you think is a real interesting opportunity for OneWeb, and one that you think you'll do well in over the next few years, which one would you highlight?
Well, I guess I would be careful in answering that question because I have lots of customers here in the audience and I want to make sure that they understand that we're focused on all of them. But I think just in terms of the amount of capacity that we're likely, if you look at the public announcements of our distribution partner agreements that are actually a matter of public record, what you see is that many of the majority of them are actually telephone companies.
Yeah. Let me go to you, Mark, on this one next. I know you've got some interesting thoughts, and obviously with acquiring Inmarsat, they had some plans to build a low Earth orbit network as well. I mean, how do you see sort of where the customers are going to come from, the balance, and how that might evolve for Viasat, particularly as you now take on these Inmarsat assets as well, and the change there?
Yeah. So one, I just from the technology perspective, because we are still a technology provider, and we see technology as driving what's possible. One of the things from the ground segment perspective that we always look at is the technology. The hardware is really just a means to access the service, right? So we have been very focused on making sure that we can drive down bandwidth costs. That's generally what people want in these environments. And so a lot of what's gone into the ground segment technology has been making space more productive. And this is a little bit complicated. Partly it used to be that we made space more productive only because it was expensive to get stuff in space. Now the notion, one of the things I would say is the notion that, well, I can put stuff up in space cheaply so it doesn't need to be productive, I think is a very scary and dangerous notion. And so, the idea of having hundreds of satellites and being able to deliver global, cost-effective, good global services is very admirable. I think it's like, hey, if I were a cellular operator and I went into your neighborhood and say, hey, the good thing about me is I'm going to have way more towers than anybody else, I don't think that would be a very attractive value proposition. Yet, people seem to be excited about the notion that, hey, I can make up 10 satellites a day, right? Why is that? To me, that's a bug, not a feature. But what you really want is you want to deliver cost-effective bandwidth. That's what we're focused on. And I think there's multiple venues in which you want to do it. So that the Inmarsat one really speaks to the mobility one, which is very difficult. I think one of the things that's really unique about it, and the difficulty is, there's some perception that the hard part is the global coverage, but actually the hardest part, and I think our customers have realized this, is that mobility tends to be, while airplanes and ships go all around the world, if you look at where they dwell the most, it's near the big cities. So for instance, if I'm a global airline, what I really need is, yes, I need some bandwidth all around the world, but I need a lot of bandwidth in London or Dubai or Tokyo or New York or Los Angeles. And so this geographic distribution of bandwidth is one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to. The other one, and this is really important from an Inmarsat perspective, one of the things that's going on, we see a big opportunity in, is because of broadband, there's been migration up to higher and higher frequencies, and we've led that. I don't think that's over with. But when you have the global mobility business, one of the big important aspects of that is safety. And safety really can be accomplished with lower bandwidth, but very high availability. And so the L-band spectrum, which we think hasn't gotten as much focus from a productivity perspective, is a really big opportunity for us. We think that's one of the exciting things about Inmarsat, even though that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I think it's the ability to reuse that spectrum in really important ways is one of the attractive areas for us. But at the end, I do think that the biggest markets are going to be connecting the unconnected. There's so many people, and more, they're migrating from getting broadcast to getting things over the internet. Broadband bandwidth, broadband video is a huge thing, and so again, driving down the cost of bandwidth is a big thing. And the other thing is, half of the problem of connecting people, the rest of the people in the world, is economic, not geographic. Right? So it's not about reach, it's really about bandwidth density and affordability. So that's kind of the breadth of things that we're undertaking. I think it's super exciting because the markets are so big.
John, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with the analogy of, if you came along and said, our network has many more base stations, but equally, I think if you also said your handset can only connect to this network, that would also be a challenging proposition, right? In other words, if you wanted to roam, you wanted to move across to different networks, you'd have to have multiple handsets in your pocket. And so, particularly as an example in defense, and so this comes back to value. The affordability is a given. Every business case must close in every vertical. I think everybody understands that. But if we're talking about value and margin and growing the pie for the industry, look at defense. Look at the US digital modernization strategy, which is clearly stating that it does not want to be dependent on one particular system at any one time. And this is about keeping the world a safer place. If you're watching the television on Ukraine and thinking, what can I do? Believe me, everybody in this room is already participating. The reason that the US and NATO close behind is going down this route is because of the natural need for superiority and resiliency for NATO forces facing disruption from near-peer rivals. And that has an intrinsic value. And so what we're trying to do is to create convergence. We see operators speak from their own from their own position, and we totally understand and respect that. But we also think there's an expanding opportunity to say, what happens in combination? What happens when our ecosystem is presented in combination, converged, concurrent, in a unified way to the US government, for example, so that they can converge MilSatCom with ComSatCom? Because that is the ultimate weakness of Russia, for example. Evil has no friends. This industry is incredibly strong. It has launch vehicles that can land themselves. It has satellites in every orbit, all designed differently with amazing capabilities, but a limited opportunity to converge them down into one place and then do different things that either protect lives or close the business case for broadband. And I think there's never been a better moment and a sense of mission to actually deliver these capabilities, which frankly Russia cannot access today, and provide them unified to NATO and their forces. So when I'm talking about value, that's the type of thing that I mean. And it's about, really we have an industry right now that's trying to open up, but is essentially siloed. And so I think that's the opportunity for us around the table, is to completely redifferentiate satellite services, and that's the role that we're trying to play.
Does anybody want to follow up on that? Can we redifferentiating satellite services? Are we?
I think the technologies that are enabling this differentiation are bringing about some great network opportunities. So, Ukraine is demonstrating that. I mean, our industry is ever so important now in terms of connecting people out there who are dispersed, but it's also the government sector is looking at, how can we offer, work with a resilient network? What is enabling a resilient network? Do we want to have a single geo satellite taken, out? Should we have more proliferated LEO constellations? The United States is really pursuing that from a national defense space architecture, and the Space Development Agency is really pushing that with their different approaches to the different tranches that they're putting out there. And they're very open to engaging and putting technologies that will be interoperable with commercial networks that, Dan or Neil are putting up. So those are the types of things that I think can really bring about some real effective value, to borrow from you, in doing some of these things. And technology providers like us are a small part of it, but we're a critical component of it for the future in making that happen.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have a mantra internally with OneWeb that we are not the solution, we're part of the solution. And so the way we see ourselves is that we work with the ecosystem to provide the best possible solutions for our customers, whether they be UT manufacturers, managing optical links, because we're not a vertically integrated business, and nor do we intend to. But I just want, I think this is a very, very important point. This morning I think it's, well, Chris, we've done it. We've announced an arrangement, a commercial arrangement with Eutelsat. Our goal would be to have commercial arrangements with all the satellite providers, right? Frankly, for the customer and the user, they don't care, frankly, whether it's a LEO, MEO, or GEO, or basically it's fiber or this. All they want is the connectivity. So our role is, we see us as we're part of that. We aim to participate with everybody in the marketplace. The collaboration is an incredibly important point. It's central to what we believe, but it's also central to solving these difficult problems of connectivity, but also solving these national security issues that we're all going to be grappling with now as we go forward.
Neil, just one follow-up. What were your sort of observations? I mean, you're one of the new speakers in the industry, and what were your observations when you came into the industry, and what did you sort of think, and has it sort of matched your perception when you came into the industry?
Well, in some ways, I didn't quite know what to expect, actually, because I'm not unlike a number of people around this table, frankly, and Mark was very gracious with me. He took me out for dinner at the Space Symposium last year, and I got a bit of a tutorial from him, and Matt Desch, I'm seeing right after this, is going to give me another tutorial, no doubt, as well. And I will tell you that they warned me that things don't quite go as planned. They are right. But I would say that I think the thing that's really impressed me, and I worked in a large technology organization previously, is that the pace of innovation and the technical brilliance it really is something to behold, and I think that's evident from the people we see here on the stage. I think where the, you know, I come from a sort of B2B background, and actually focusing on the customer, you know, that's great. That technical innovation is fantastic, but you have to harness it around actually understanding customers and solving their needs. And so I think we're very strong in one area, and perhaps not so strong on the other. And I think that's and you know, you don't want to lose the first, but you want to improve on the second, I would say.
Yeah, just on a couple. Oh,
sure.
Yeah, Mark, then we'll go to Sarah.
Yeah, just on a couple of things. One is, to John's point in interoperability, absolutely, we're a big believer in interoperability. I think mobility has been a good application of interoperability because vessels travel all around the world and they need to hook up to different systems. And so we, you know, when I talk about working and helping other countries develop their own space capabilities, you know, for instance, in Australia, we help them with their national broadband network. In Brazil, we help them with Telebras, with their SEGC network. And that sort of integrates their own capabilities into this more global fabric, which is very much conditioned on interoperability. And really that's kind of two things. One is think of it just an RF antenna perspective, and then the other is from a network and modem perspective. So we agree with that. The other one on the resilience, main point I would make on resilience, which is certainly valuable, is I don't think that if you look at resilience on the y-axis versus the number of satellites, resilience does not increase monotonically. It goes like this, right? There's a point at which, and this is, you know, kind of what we just heard, is there's a point beyond which the fragility of the system increases, and that you, as a space user, are sensitive not just to the resilience of your own network, but to everybody around you, which is one of the big differences at LEO, because at GEO, I mean, it's a lot simpler because all the satellites are going in the same direction, the relative velocity is low, so the chances of a major catastrophe are much less. But in LEO, when you have all these ones intersecting at very high speed and at various angles of incidence, and then you look at the models for debris dispersion, we just saw this confirmed with the ASAT test, you know, that at some point resilience starts going down. And our main issue is just to, let's just do the engineering and the analysis, which we're certainly capable of figuring out what that point is, right?
Before I go to Sarah, do you believe there's a certain recklessness in the industry at the moment? Then? I mean,
absolutely.
I know Neil and Dan saying we were talking about hundreds, but when you add all of the ones together that are planning, it's thousands, tens of thousands.
Millions. It's gone over 1 million. Yeah. So I think that the recklessness is only from to me, the issue is just, it's an engineering problem. We just need to quantify it, and we have all the tools to do it. So the recklessness isn't necessarily the rate at which they're going, it's not knowing what we're heading to. Right? What are the limits, and then how do we allocate them fairly? I think once we understand that, then we can proceed as fast as we want, or as we can. But I don't know why we wouldn't want to just do the engineering and know what the answer is, and then have at it.
Sarah.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that space services, the definition is expanding. We've pioneered the space logistics, and we've successfully launched 2 mission extension vehicles and connected with geosynchronous commercial satellites to extend their life. And we continue to invest and augment that through robotics vehicles. And as that market continues to grow, I think we'll see, you know, as we go to deep space, cislunar, you know, the amount of satellite services, the different types of markets that are going to emerge are going to continue to grow.
Okay. Any follow-up on those comments? Let me go to the next question. We often talk about in space, there's always been a great collaboration between nations, between companies, and you know, that's something that's a hallmark of our industry. But bearing in mind what's going on now in Ukraine, do we think sort of the Cold War now is going to extend to space? And if it does, what will this mean for players up here in our overall industry, and do we expect that to happen? So, Tina, do you want to? Nice, easy question.
So from our vantage point, when we're looking at technology and we're trying to bring about products into the space environment or the airborne environment or the ground environment for critical customers, government or even commercial, we're having to scrutinize our supply chain even more. And we already have restrictions on where procurement parts can come from, specifically electronics and things. And we have to really scrutinize every layer, every component that we incorporate into our products. That has just expanded, and that list is just going to grow. So beyond the electronics and the hardware, we have to now make sure we're looking at the software level as well, and adopting various standards there. But yes, I think rightfully so, we need to scrutinize a lot of things. But that's not to say that we can't serve friendly nations in terms of the products that we're launching and building, collaborating on various constellations. So those are the types of things that I think will continue. But I think it's a simple fact that we have to be very careful on what goes into the makeup of our products in the near term.
Yeah, Mark, I think, forgive me, for giving you a very direct answer. It certainly feels to me as if the Cold War in space has started. And I think that is the reality we have to live with. And I think it speaks actually to Mark's comments. I think, it's unusual to see somebody from the business community sitting on the stage at an industry conference saying, actually, I think we need more regulation, not less. Yeah. Right, more regulation. Because the reality is that, whilst I wouldn't agree with everything that Mark says, there's certainly, I agree with lots of what he has to say. And so the reality is we're now in a situation whereby, the geopolitical balance has changed, right? We know that we already know there's been attacks on satellites in space. The reality is that we are launching hundreds of satellites. We've got 428 already up there. We're the second largest satellite operator in the world at this point. And I think we firmly believe that actually having some rules and guidelines around what responsible design looks like, what responsible operation looks like, and what responsible exit looks like, that space is a shared resource. It's a shared resource for all of us. We all know it's incredibly important from a strategic perspective. It's incredibly important at a basic human and social level in leveling the playing field and digital connectivity. Having some rules around that and some guidelines that we all play with, that like-minded folks play with, I think is exactly the right way to go, and I encourage that.
Dan, do you agree with that in terms of regulation, or how do you see the situation developing for the industry and the impact?
It feels like we're talking about two things now. One is, Ukraine and the incident there and what that means in terms of international cooperation between countries and regions and whatnot. Another piece is what, Mark has spoken about and Neil picked up on about the need for a regulatory framework to make sure that space is available for everyone to make use of. So maybe I'll talk to both of them. On the latter, yeah, 100%. We've been responsibly using space for about half a century now, and the environment is changing. There's much greater access to space, and there are more and more objects that are showing up in space, and many, many more planned. On the one hand, that's great. On the other hand, it creates significant risks that need to be properly managed, and because it all takes place in this space commons, and as we've all seen in this industry for years and years and years, there's no one authority that can regulate what happens in space. At the end of the day, we all have to, and when I say we all the countries in the world and everyone who's making use of space, there need to be rules of the road, and we all need to follow them. And do there need to be more rules of the road now, given what's happening? Yeah, probably, and different Companies have suggested different things. It's complicated, but for sure, there needs to be a beefed up regulatory environment to make sure that space is used responsibly and it's available for everyone to use. So that's number one. And then just quickly on Ukraine and what that might mean for international collaboration in space. I'm not sure that it'll change things that much. For sure, what's happening in Ukraine right now has highlighted and underscored how important space is and how strategic space is. But there have always been barriers to the ability to work with any country that you want to work with. I mean, if you look at the ITAR regime, for a long, long time, there have been massive restrictions around technology sharing, massive restrictions around what launch vehicles you can use and whatnot. And so I think that those things will continue. There will be groups of countries in the world that we can all work with, we can share technology with, that will come together. Space cries out for collaboration, given that it is, you know, a commons up there, but also given that it's expensive and you need, you know, countries working together and governments working together to fully leverage space, but we're not all able to work with each other, just given the realities of geopolitics, and I think Ukraine reinforces that, but I'm not sure that it changes it that much.
Sarah, any thoughts on this?
So in terms of, for instance, space exploration, I think there's a long history of collaboration, and that's going to continue, and that, you know, we tend to rise above these moments in pursuit of human discovery and exploration. On the regulatory environment, I think, you know, it's similar to the evolution of the commercial aviation environment. That, you know, over time we have learned to operate globally and with understanding of, you know, who's going where when. And I think that, you know, we as industry have to partner with governments and establish that framework for space operations.
Just one more question. I'm going to direct this one to Mark. I'm also the chairperson of an event called Cyber Leo and CyberSat, where we look at cyber security and satellites. And obviously this feels like this is going to become a bigger issue. And Viasat's been in the news lately as well. Can you give us any update on that? And do you see more sort of targeted cyber attacks on satellite assets?
So the answer to the last question is yes, for sure. Okay. You know, for ours, you know, we acquired KSAT in Europe. We acquired a customer base with that. The customer base that we acquired is still being operated by a third party as part of a transition agreement. So it turns out, you know, on the cyber event, we have a very good understanding of exactly what happened. Typically, what we do on our own networks is we monitor everything that goes on in the network, and we believe that for this particular event, it was preventable. But we didn't have that capability in that case, and what it did do was it took thousands of terminals offline. Didn't affect the satellite, didn't affect the network infrastructure, but it did take a number of modems offline. So we figured that out, and we're restoring service. It's in a number of cases, most of the cases of the modems that went offline, they need to be replaced. They can be refurbished, so we're cycling modems through. And so that, I think we're very sensitive to the customers that have been disrupted, that we inherited. We're working as fast as we can to bring them on. Some of them are, you know, I mean, they're very, very impacted. But in the overall scheme of things, it wasn't, you know, will be worse cyber attacks than that if we're not really vigilant. Some of that comes to, as Tina was saying, dealing with supply chain. A lot of it comes with the networking and the cybersecurity that's baked into that network. And, you know, it's a constant battle. It's part of what we do. We think we do it reasonably well. We didn't have a chance to apply what we do in this case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, just to echo what Mark was saying, in the last 18 months or so, we've been responding to a series of requests for proposals on various programs, and more we're seeing requirements that are coming in around cybersecurity, very specific requirements around the adoption of various standards. Awards are reliant on companies demonstrating that they've adopted this at various levels in the technology stack. So I think that's just to do our best as an industry to avoid the outages at the consumer level, at the satellite level, at a ground station level. So those are things that I think are inevitable. That's the big surge in terms of how we secure the various components in the technology stack in the network. And yes, optical comms is very secure in terms of communication and resiliency, but you have software around the chain that you have to make sure is also secure.
Okay. We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to open it up to the audience in just over 5 minutes, so we'll take 1 or 2 questions. So if you've got any questions, start thinking about them now. I'm going to try and get a quick answer to this, which is always dangerous when you have a satellite crowd. So we'll do our best. Are the constellations, the low Earth orbit constellations, are they essentially going to become the mainstream of our industry over the next few years? And I'm going to go around each and every one of you and get your opinion on this and see what you think. So, Dan, I know you're obviously building Lightspeed, but we've done interviews before, and you've spoken about there was always like a necessity for Telesat to do things. But when you look, say, maybe 5 years later on in this decade, do you think it will be the LEO, it will be the ones with low Earth orbit assets will be the mainstream of our industry, and GEO will become the niche?
I think. Like all of these transitions, it'll take a while. But I think, I'm not sure about 5 years, 10 years. I believe so. Now, again, when I think about the market, I'm thinking about what we're focused on, which is kind of the enterprise market. So I'll put consumer broadband off to the side, but I believe, and obviously Telesat sort of, putting our money where our mouth is, but I believe the value proposition for the delivery of enterprise broadband services is going to be so much more compelling in LEO that yes, that's my view, that 10 years from now, that LEO will become more predominant.
Let me go, Sarah.
Yeah, I think, right now we have a mixture. And the mixture is because there are different missions, there are different customers, and they have different needs, and the different orbits service those needs in different ways. So I think that mixture is going to continue, because as needs evolve, there are places and orbits where optimizing those missions will not necessarily always be in LEO.
I think they're highly complementary. And I think actually what you'll see is increasing commercial integration between those systems as you go forward. And frankly, increasing commercial integration between not just LEO and GEO, but between LEO, GEO, MEO, fiber, microwave, 5G. It all comes together basically. So I don't see one being a niche, or that each element of it is part of the solution. They each have different roles to play in different use cases.
I agree with what Neil just said. I think the LEO market is not just all about a comms market. There's the Earth observation market that is really coming to fruition in terms of the capability and the industries outside of ours that are reliant on this information and data. We're seeing architectures of LEO constellations that are relying on a MEO data relay system, for example, looking further ahead, in terms of incorporating even a GEO relay system as part of all of that. But I do believe LEO plays a critical role beyond the latency. I mean, you'll recall people used to just talk about latency and LEO, but I think there's a significant role to play in terms of getting a product out there faster, incorporating some specific bandwidth to specific regions. Mobility use cases are critical to be served through a LEO constellation. So those are the types of things, based on the use case, a complementary mesh network is what's going to come through.
John?
On one level, I've got to be honest, I don't really care, in the sense that the more satellites you put up, the more it gravitates to the need to access multiple satellites at the same time in multiple orbits, and that's what we do. But I think there's actually a sort of if you compare it to the mobile industry, which is always really operators try and talk a different game, but the truth of it is they're really constrained by capacity, coverage, price, and latency. And because it's a highly standardized, highly commoditized area. And there is a sort of a silver lining in, to some degree, a lack of that standardization, in the sense that, there is a misconception around satellites. They are designed incredibly differently. Frequency hopping, very high throughput, onboard processing, in different orbits with different capabilities. And our view is converged, they're to be enjoyed. And so I think that they are, in that respect, absolutely complementary to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, complementary. I also think that the real answer will come from the market. It won't come from us. Yeah. But I think what we expect is that we're going to provide multi-band, multi-orbit, integrate with terrestrial, and you're going to figure out, it's like with 5G. It's like, would you say mid-band is going to obsolete L-band? No, of course you're going to use a blend. It becomes more and more straightforward to integrate capabilities so that you'll have terminals that are multi-band, multi-orbit. And then I think what you'd really want to do is optimize service delivery for the needs of each customer at that time. And that's what we're trying to do. And it's not just, and I think the other thing to add to it, it's not just purely technical. Some of it's going to be driven by the place in which you deliver that bandwidth. So in some cases, we're going to work with host countries that have their own facilities they want to use. So we want to integrate those in. I think the idea is build around the customer, serve their needs, and use the best resource available for that. And for GEO, it's going to be high density demand in certain markets. I think on the LEO front, one of the reasons is going to be, well, hey, this LEO is sold out in this market, so just use another one, right? And in another place, it'll be the other way around, right? Because the geographic density of bandwidth for LEO is so constrained. So I think you're going to have to fold all this stuff in and optimize for the customer.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to the audience now. We've got time for one or two questions. Not used to the bright lights anymore. Do we have any questions? I think. Oh, over here. Can we?
I think I'm a bit of a loud talker. Can y'all hear me? I gotta go over there.
Oh, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
That's all right. It's been a while since we've done these things, so.
If there's one good thing, I'm decent at running in heels. So we've talked a lot about the intersection of the space industry and the satellite industry with international diplomacy in terms of conflict, but I was wondering if you could speak more about the intersection of the commercial sector with international diplomacy as a form of cooperation. I think that's definitely something that I'm very interested in as an early career professional, and if you have any thoughts or experiences, I'd love to hear them. Thank you.
Is it about cooperation?
I think so.
I can try to address that a little bit. So cooperation in this industry has already, as I think you pointed out, solicited cooperation across whether it's a supply chain that is reliant on components and capabilities from one country to another. This industry is also great about whether you're a government sector or commercial sector, relying on parts and and cooperation on joint missions, whether it's human space flight or whether it's development of a constellation. You've got players here who've got investments from global governments and their commercial operators. So Neil can talk to that more than I can. But cooperation, diplomacy, policies around our industry are prevalent. So I think they'll continue, and they're at different levels.
Can I have one thing is, again, going back to what's changed, think of it as, okay, the strongest space power is stronger, but what about the rest of the world? The rest of the world wants to use space too, and so one of the issues, I'll just give you an example, because of space debris, there's some calls that say we should not allow non-propulsive CubeSats to be in certain orbits, right? Well, that makes tons of sense if you've got the capability to launch things that are much more sophisticated and autonomous. But if you're a country that aspires to get into space, to get the jobs, the intellectual knowledge that goes with that, having big, strong countries tell emerging markets that you can't do that is probably not going to work. I think that's one of the things when we talk about being inclusive about the use of space. I think that we need to think about that really seriously along these lines.
Okay. We maybe have time for one more question. Okay.
Michael Sheets with CNBC. This probably is most suited for OneWeb and Telesat, but we hear a lot from the launch market operators that they see only a certain number of winners in each section of the marketplace. But you guys are approaching this from the constellation, the demand side. So how do you see that demand, and is there enough supply coming online in terms of launch services, maybe just here alone in the United States or more broadly around the world, which is being highlighted by the fact that the Russian Soyuz is effectively going offline for much of the marketplace?
Yeah, I'll take the first shot maybe. Thanks for the question. Yeah, we're actually quite encouraged that there are more and more launch options available to folks like us than there've ever been. And here again, I'll say it again, we're not launching thousands and thousands and thousands of satellites. We need multiple launch vehicles, but we don't need hundreds and hundreds of launch vehicles. We need kind of high teens kind of number of rockets to achieve our objectives. So yeah, that's certainly one part of the supply chain we feel great about. Whether you're launching multiple satellites on a single rocket, or you're just sort of doing more fleet maintenance or adding some satellites in a particular orbit, there are a multiplicity of smaller launch service providers that will allow a company like ours to launch 1, 2, 3 satellites at a time at economics that make a whole lot of sense.
So, Mike, I would say that, so I think actually as you look ahead, it is likely that in terms of large, medium-sized heavy launch vehicles, it looks like there's going to be some degree of shortage of them based upon what you see today. That said, I think we're proof that within sort of 3 weeks we've managed to find alternative launch options. So that's a matter of public record. And I think thirdly, what will happen is that other countries and other providers will see this as actually an opportunity to participate in space. So I think what you will see is over the next few months is that there will be other countries that will emerge who will want to fill the gap that Roscosmos and has decided to create right now. So in short answer, yes, it's something that I worry about, but not something I worry about overly.
Okay. Well, I think I'll leave it there. I want to thank the panelists. I think that was a really great session. Let's give them a big round of applause. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the show. It's great to be back in person, and yeah, we look forward to seeing what you get out of the show, and we'll see you again next year. Thank you.